Hi, everyone. It's so it's so nice to see you, as it always is. Welcome back. It's my absolute pleasure in a time pretty devoid of pleasure to welcome you to Seminar 6, which is co-run by Parapraxis and the Psychosocial Foundation. The seminar was put together by Wendy, if you want to wave Wen, Alex, and myself. Quickly, for those who are joining for the first time, we're so excited to have you. I know there are many repeat folks who have been here for all six, which is amazing. The Psychosocial Foundation is a nonprofit in the state of California. It's an educational organization that exists to advance our understanding of where the social, political, and psychological converge. Home to multiple persuasions within psychoanalysis, the tradition inaugurated, but not delimited to Sigmund Freud. Our programming, like this, illuminates the psychogenic dimensions of culture and society, mental health and medicine, and political life. If you're not on our mailing list and you found out about the seminar another way, you can be. We'd love that. And you can find it here at the bottom of our website. In addition to this twice annual seminar with Parapraxis, the next one will be on romance in fall 2025. We host one-off lectures, book events. We host a lot of short courses, small seminars, four of which are enrolling right now. And one will begin in just a week's time. And you're welcome to check them out. They're on the website. And we also publish Parapraxis magazine, who's co-hosting this seminar with us, which you can read here. I will just say that tomorrow we'll be posting the first preview from issue 5, Economies, which, as happens every time, grew out of our seminar last fall. And so we're always very grateful to the seminar. Some housekeeping, as they say. The seminar will meet every Sunday from now through the end of March. Today, we will begin, and it's such our pleasure and honor, with Dr. David Lichtenstein. We're so lucky to have him, and I'll introduce him in a moment. But first, a word on our topic, resistance, which we will study together for the next 10 weeks. In 1911, Sigmund Freud addressed his followers gathered at Nuremberg. There, he restated the import of his practice, now more firmly established. Quote, "The task of psychoanalysis lies not at all in the discovering of complexes, but in the dissolving of resistances," end quote. Freud might be read as urging his followers to help a patient move through their resistance, acquiring the pain of being more fully alive in relation to the world and to their objects. Conceived in this way, psychoanalysis is a project on the side of material, but also political reality, which includes the absolute centrality of uprising and resistance against systems that seek to destroy life on this planet, and they do so all the time. It can be read as a practice that insists on bringing patients out of isolation and into social struggle. More frequently, however, it is glossed in the exact reverse, as one of an isolated ameliorism for the stubborn and incorrigible individual. It is both a political and clinically technical question whether psychoanalysis exists only in the closed circuit of an individual's singular suffering, or whether it is a social scientific practice of enlarging the scope of a person's world. Either way, resistance is the central fulcrum by which political and psychical resistance often work at cross purposes, historically splitting psychoanalytic institutions in their aims. We see this all the time. Should psychoanalysis only succeed at rendering patients compliant in their cure, bringing them into the zone where ordinary unhappiness may be purchased? If so, Freud's pithy edict for the aim of psychoanalysis is now but an epitaph. And indeed, for over 100 years, psychoanalysis has been treated, we might add, quite rightly, as a tool for nullifying political resistance, and it's been critiqued as such. But why should psychoanalysis retreat from the collective symptoms back into the consulting room for individual treatment, its limited sanctuary for lone individuals, and away from strikes, riots, and uprisings, and towards complacency and normativity, if not quite literally the babies and marriages that were counseled on the couch at mid-century? The sciences, PSY, have acted as handmaidens in the project of pathologizing political resistance by offering diagnoses that capture and repress political actors. By virtue of resistance, it has seemed to escape the notice of psychological institutions that this antisocial method and aim is itself a political decision. Together, altogether, we will look at questions of resistance and repression from both within psychoanalysis and leftist traditions. So we will start, and for those of you returning from any of our previous seminars, this will be familiar with classic psychoanalytic texts. First, this week, Freud, next week, Ferenczi and Winnicott, and in the final week of that section, Fanon. And then we will move into the sort of sociological and political questions of resistance. And we will end in a kind of hybrid of thinking of the contemporary left of psychoanalysis. Just a word on the seminar, you should have received a welcome email from me with all the readings via Google Drive. We update them constantly. We'll meet at the same link every week. If there's a change, you'll receive an email, so do read our emails. Our format today will be standard for all 10 weeks. We're going to hear from our presenter, Dr. David Lichtenstein. We'll be speaking to Freud, and you'll be invited to ask him questions. We'll run about 90 minutes, so please feel free to make use of the chat. Wendy will be moderating. And with all of that out of the way, it's my, again, absolute pleasure to introduce our speaker who will teach us about Freud's multiple conceptions of resistance. So Dr. David Lichtenstein is a psychoanalyst in practice in New York City. I was joking in the so-called green room before. He's also like founded everything. He currently works with both adults and children in his private practice, but out there in the world, he's the founding editor of Division Review, which remains an essential venue on the left of psychoanalysis. He's the co-founder of the Après-Coup Psychoanalytic Association, a co-founder of the new Pulsion Institute in New York. He's on faculty at NYU postdoc and also at CUNY and also at NYU. That David made time for us is kind of astounding. He's worked with Das Unbehagen in its immediate inception and on and on. And he's written dozens of articles and book chapters that are especially interested in Lacanian psychoanalysis. And he's the co-editor of the book, The Lacan Tradition, that came out in 2018. He's been involved in all kinds of left and psychoanalytic activity in New York City for many years. And with that, I'll get out of the way and just say, please welcome David.
Thanks, Anna. It's nice to see you. It's nice to see everyone. Thanks, Wendy, Alex. I look forward very much to this discussion. Hannah got in touch with me a little while ago and told me about this project and the topic that we would be addressing, and it's so timely and so apt and connected with a lot of things that I was thinking about and working on already, and so I agreed to do it. Not though because I have a particular paper that I want to present or a project that I've already formed. So it's going to be me talking from my notes, notes that I've developed since Hannah and I planned this event. And I hope that'll be all right. For you, it'll be a little bit more meandering, a little bit more exploratory than me reading a prepared text. I look forward to your comments and questions, and I'm sure that we'll be able to have plenty of time to field those and discuss things, and when the time comes. The text that I really want to work around to, I'm not going to start there, but I'll just sort of point to it and then work our way around back to it again, is a fairly late text in Freud's writings. It's in Inhibitions, Symptoms, and Anxiety, and it's the addendum to the actual article. After he writes the article, Freud adds a section, and it's in that section that he addresses, returns to the topic of resistance, and says some things about it, some statements about it that as I say, I will be that I want to ultimately get to in terms of understanding the Freudian perspective on resistance. One of the things clearly that we're sort of juggling here or operating with is the question of cross-discipline thinking. Is resistance, as the psychoanalyst uses the term, resistance as a political activist thinks that uses the term? What are the relationship? What is the relationship between those two uses? What are other meanings of the term resistance? Resistance itself in ordinary speech has so many different meanings, right? Without even getting into the cross-disciplinary question, to resist another serving of ice cream is very different than resisting, the state apparatus, in a demonstration, or resisting, if somebody is pushing you, in a crowded subway. There are lots of different ways of resisting. The term covers a wide variety, but that first one, of course, they're resisting a temptation, resisting a desire, resisting even as a kind of mark of that desire. That's something to kind of keep in mind because it'll return in psychoanalysis in very interesting ways. So, although I just said that it's important for us to kind of recognize how terms function as terms of art, and be fairly respectful of the psychoanalytic meaning of the term resistance, it never really works completely. There's always a kind of leakage, if you might put it that way, or a kind of drift between the way the word works as a term of art and its general meaning, its meaning in other contexts, how we re-understand its meaning in the particular discourse, like in the psychoanalytic frame. So interrogating a concept like that, it means being sensitive to all of those linguistic and conceptual factors in what we mean by the concept and what we mean by interrogating it. So immediately, I guess I want to say that I'm going to try to sustain both of those principles. That is, the principle that there is a sense in which to understand resistance as a term of art in psychoanalysis, and particularly a Freudian concept. There is a way in which it's useful and important to understand how Freud struggled with the term resistance. So I say struggled with it, how he worked with it, how he developed it over time, how he had to change his notions of it, etc. Because in doing that, in understanding how Freud wrestled with this term resistance, we understand more and more about how psychoanalysis operates as a logic. It operates as a logic. Freud confronts the logic. He sees gaps. He sees problems. Any reader of Freud, I think, comes to see that over the course of Freud's career, one of the striking things is how he's constantly returning and reworking and saying, I didn't get it quite right the first time. Let me try again. I don't think I even have it right this time. Maybe somebody in the future will fix it. That psychoanalysis is the engagement with a set of problems that are constantly in need of being worked through. Now, this is the Freudian perspective. This isn't always the way we get the Freudian perspective presented. It's very often the contrary. That is, that is academically or in the psychoanalytic institutes, etc. It's as if the Freudian perspective is a set way of thinking, and you either accept it or you don't accept it. Are you a Freudian? Do you understand the Freudian model, rather than that the Freudian perspective is precisely this invitation to continually rethink the dialectic that Freud put in motion, or Freud, I should say, discovered. You know, this gets back to something that Freud said, and it bears re-saying, which is that when we speak about psychoanalysis, we're speaking about three related disciplines. We're speaking about a theory of the subject, right? Psychoanalysis as a theory. We're speaking about a method of research, psychoanalysis as a process to study the subject, and we're thinking about it as a therapeutic practice of some sort, right? And that psychoanalysis is those three things, and how they inform one another, also how they subvert one another. So that this point I was making about Freud struggling with a concept like resistance, it's in part that he uses the concept in one framework, and then that is, for example, in the theory of the subject, and then encounters something that he thinks might be related to that in his clinical work. And then he has to revise how it works in the theory of the subject because of something he encounters in his clinical work. So there's this kind of internal dialectic in psychoanalysis for Freud and for any of us who want to understand something like the concept of resistance in Freud, to try to follow that internal dialectic. And then even more interestingly, of course, is not just follow it, but then join it, right? And say, where do we stand now? What's unresolved? What did Freud bequeath to us to continue in terms of this working through of these dialectical questions? So just, as an illustration of that, early on in the project for a scientific psychology, where Freud, even before he calls it a psychoanalysis, he's still calling it a psychology, is trying to develop a neuronal model of consciousness, how consciousness arises organically through what was known then about brain functions. And one of the key elements in that model that Freud works for the psychic apparatus in the project for scientific psychology is the idea that some perceptions pass into the psyche, in a sense, transparently. Whereas others encounter a kind of resistance, a kind of difficulty in entering the psyche, perceptions that in some way disturb the psyche. And that it's these perceptions that he says operate neuronally as having a kind of resistance to them. Something about the nerve systems and the networks of neurons then resist this new perception. And it's in that resistance that something like the elaboration of consciousness takes place, because that resistance requires the brain to modify its structure. It needs to do something new because something is not working. It's the not working that makes for organization, complexification, development of the psyche, etc. So early on, there is this concept that is resistance. This is not resistance in the sense that it is operating in the clinical frame, right? This is resistance as it operates in the model of the subject, in the model, insofar as the project is an early model of the subject. In the clinical frame, the earliest sense you get of the term resistance is really related to the process of clinical work, which is that the patient is invited to say everything and stops at certain points from that project of saying everything. The patient says, yes, I will cooperate with the doctor who's inviting me to say everything. I will cooperate with this cure. But something happens. The patient stops. The patient says, I can't say this, or there's a gap, or there's a hesitation. So in a very different sense than what we just talked about in terms of the theory of the subject, Freud says there's a resistance. There's a resistance in treatment. And it's this resistance, which in that early stage, as Hannah just indicated in the introduction, in that resistance in the early stage, which Freud says needs to be overcome, needs to be done away with. We've got to get rid of that resistance so that the memories, the mnemic traces, the trauma that it gives rise to the pathology can come forward, right? So that's the earliest clinical sense of the term. But just as there's a dialectical interplay between theories of the subject, clinical theory in Freud, there's also in Freud a process where, as he conducts his practice and as he works with other clinicians conducting their practice over time, they begin to discover aspects of treatment that they hadn't anticipated. And there is a kind of revision of the theory. And that certainly happens with the question of resistance. It expresses itself in different ways than the initial expression that I just articulated, which is just a kind of hesitation to go on, right? One of the first significant ways that it expressed itself that caused Freud to rethink the concept of resistance had to do with the idea that one of the ways the analysand stops is in relation to the analyst. Is that there's a kind of stopping, which is not just stopping in the sense that now I'm the analysand. I don't want to say that, or I can't remember anything about that, or I don't know, any more than I've said, that first kind of resistance, or simply I have nothing to say, but something about you, doctor, I can't say this to you, or I'm so aware of the fact that I'm going to be talking to you about this. There's something in saying it to you that just suddenly changes everything about what I was about to say. Either that gets articulated or that doesn't get articulated, but that gets experienced. And this resistance emerges in Freud's awareness. And of course, that's transference resistance. It's a different, Freud has to account for this other sense of resistance, which is different from that first sense of resistance. So that we see that in Freud's papers on technique in the teens when he writes about transference, and especially when he writes about transference love. This idea that something like love comes into play in the analysis in significant ways it is very, very important to trying to understand the trajectory of resistance. Let me pause there in the sequence that I've been giving and talk a little bit about, again, this idea of moving across disciplines and across categories. One of the things that Freud was referencing when he talked about neuronal systems was the idea that the mind, the psyche, was something like a kind of apparatus, was something like a kind of a device, right? Could we come up with a model of the psyche as a psychic apparatus? And that was it about a psychic apparatus that had to do with the flow of energy as a drive somehow expressing itself in life. And that this was what the function of the psychic apparatus was, to manage and guide and develop that flow of energy. Well, that sort of turning to a model of sort of physics, one of the things that you can turn to in terms of the notion of resistance, when you start thinking in terms of apparatuses and machines and mechanisms, is a very simple law in physics. It's called Ohm's law, right? Ohm's law it's not very complicated. It's an early 19th century law having to do with the functioning of electricity, electrical systems. And Ohm's law, developed by Ohm, I suspect, I think in the 1820s, 1830s, simply states that there are in electrical systems, generally speaking, three factors. One factor is the power. It's called voltage in electrical terms, but we could, well, let me stay with that voltage. The second is the current, electrical current, right? And something that governs the relationship between voltage and electrical current, which is resistance, right? So there we have the term as a very fundamental term in electrical physics, right? Resistance is in any electrical system. So this idea that Freud had of the neuronal system operating through resistance, you could see was kind of analogous to what was already understood about electrical systems, right? If you have a lot of resistance in an electrical system, you get very little current, right? Even if the voltage remains the same. If the resistance in the electrical system goes down, the current increases. So it's voltage equals resistance times current, right? That's Ohm's law. Now, one of the things about Ohm's law that's interesting, there's a couple of things that are interesting as we sort of use it and take it back into something relevant to what we're talking about in psychoanalysis. One is that what we're talking about there, of course, is a drive, something equivalent to a drive, voltage, right? Something equivalent to a current, which is something flowing. We could say the flow of expression. We could say speech. We could say thought, expression, action, right? Um, and something mediating the relationship between drive and expression, which is resistance, right? Now, the fact that it mediates it, right, means that it modulates it up and down, right? What if we took the term expression or flow, uh, what is this electrical term, um, and recognize that what we mean by that term is something like desire or wish, the conveying of a wish, the expression of desire, right? So that there's a drive and there's an expression of desire, and then there's something like resistance that mediates that in between, right? Um, that mediating function of resistance, right? Uh, ultimately is a kind of refusal or a kind of hesitation, kind of holding back, which is linked to anxiety by Freud. All right, this is, I'm anticipating much, much later, right? So what we have is a conversion of Ohm's law, if you will, that is that drive equals the interplay of anxiety and desire, right? Um, I'll return to this, but I just wanted to put that on the table as helping you recognize how we can draw across disciplines and test the concept out against these sort of usages in another discipline, like in this case, physics. This idea that we move into thinking something like physics or thinking in that realm in dealing with psychoanalysis is not, it's not a new idea, right? Freud does this all the time. We do it all the time. We talk all the time about something to do with a sense of space, psychic space. Winnicott talks about transitional space. We talk about a sense of proximity or distance. Are we thinking in terms of space in the Euclidean physical sense? Or are we thinking about space in a kind of metaphoric sense, in a kind of imaginary sense, or even as Lacan would suggest, in a kind of topological sense? This sort of idea that we have to interrogate our terms, space, drive, resistance, and that one of the ways to interrogate it is to play in these other fields a bit. And then in playing it, bring it back to psychoanalysis and see how it works internally to our logic, right? That's one of the things that I'd like to suggest. Comes out of something like just envisioning something like Ohm's law when we talk about resistance, right? And there's another thing about Ohm's law which is interesting. In systems of electronics, not just electrical system, but electronic systems like a stereo, an amplifier, one of the ways that they work is by devices called resistors, right? That is that they fluctuate in terms of the resistance. So that resistance is not a constant in an electronic system. Resistance is precisely the thing which can be modulated. Not only can it be modulated, but in modulating resistance, you get the music that you listen to on the amplifier, right? The creation of sound in a way that becomes interesting is precisely the modulation of resistance in the system, right? You with me? Nod, yes, good. I got a few nods. Good, 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 good. Um, it doesn't stop there, of course. Once you start thinking in terms of the function of resistance to modulate electronic energy, you realize pretty quickly that the modulation of energy, modulation of drive, the modulation of force, is precisely what's going on, for example, when I'm speaking. That what happens in speech is that there's a force of air through my larynx, through my voice box, and my vocal cords modify the resistance to that air. And in modifying the resistance, they vibrate at different speeds. And you unconsciously, not in the psychoanalytic sense of unconscious, but in the physical unconscious, you modulate the resistance to the force of air, and you speak. Without resistance, there's no speaking, there's no singing, there's no music. A musical instrument, quite apart from an amplifier, a guitar, a flute, is all about modulating the resistance of forces through it, right? So suddenly there's this other idea about resistance. That is, resistance is not simply something to be done away with. Because if you do away with it, in some systems, you've got nothing, right? All that's of interest is exactly in being able to read or hear or play with the resistance, right? That's exactly what these systems are built on. Is that true of the system? Well, of psychoanalysis, well, we go back there now, and I can say, well, which system of psychoanalysis? Because remember, I suggested that there are several. The system of psychoanalysis as a theory of the subject, the system of psychoanalysis as in clinical work, right? The third being the system, as a research methodology. And indeed, it holds up. That is, the initial idea that what we're doing in psychoanalysis, this initial idea I talked about a little while ago, which is that we're trying to get rid of the resistance so that the memories can flow out, right? This idea which Freud began to dismantle in the teens, right, with the papers on technique. It doesn't, this original idea that we get rid of resistance, that's the function of psychoanalysis, either clinically, let's just say clinically at this point. It doesn't hold up, right? There's something else, which is that in resistance, if we take this, what is precisely what we need to listen to. It's precisely what makes for the music of psychoanalytic work, to take the analogy back. It's precisely what, like in the system of an electronic device, allows for modulation and functioning of the system is the resistance. With no resistance, there's no functioning system, right? I'll pause for a second so I can drink a glass of water, but is there any, maybe there's a question or a comment before I go on?
Yeah, and again, feel free to write comments in the or questions in the chat as David's speaking, so we can collect them or raise your hand. I think yeah, you can continue, David,
Good,
and then
good.
we'll yeah.
Oh, no, that's fine. Yep. So what happens?
Okay, so
Um,
actually, sorry to interrupt.
Go
There
ahead.
was one question just about
Right.
the so you divided it into the theory of the subject, the method of knowledge production, and the clinical practice. And there was a question about resistance as in the second of those categories as a research method. But perhaps that's what you were saying in terms of maybe it merges with clinical practice to the extent that it's a way of
I think
listening
so.
to the yeah.
I think so. I think it's a good question. I think what comes to my mind is this, is that the function of the research um, project, according to Freud, and these three categories are Freud's categories, right? Is that it helps us understand consciousness. It helps us understand the subject, right? Psychoanalysis. And that the process of curing people, quote unquote, um, is also a process of studying people and studying how the psyche works and studying how consciousness comes about. Uh, so that it's not just that we would be working with resistance so as to alleviate symptoms or work the development of the cure, but also we would be studying how does this resistance fit formally and systematically into our theory of the subject. For instance, what the example I gave, which is that, and I kind of leapt ahead, which is that one of the ways to think about resistance is its link to anxiety, right? This is a much later development in Freud. This is the kind of research project that Freud is talking about. Um, in 1926, when Freud writes Inhibition, Symptoms, and Anxiety, uh, one of the things he does in that text is change his theory of anxiety in a fundamental way. Anxiety, up until that point, at least as it's formally theorized by Freud, is a kind of uh, expression of pent up drive energy that doesn't flow, um, gets expressed as anxiety. Um, Freud says there's something about that that is not sufficient. There's something about that is not quite right. And he modifies his theory about how anxiety functions in the subject in the 1920s. And he suggests that rather than anxiety being a kind of direct expression of pent up drive energy, Anxiety is really a signal of something about to happen that is threatening to the subject. It's a signal of danger. This idea that anxiety, rather than just being a direct expression of unrelieved drive, but instead a kind of signal that there's something in the situation that's dangerous. This is a major shift in Freud's thinking. Well, it's a major shift also in how the subject, the theory of the subject, right? To get back to the question, resistance is a sign of anxiety. It's linked to anxiety. If anxiety is a signal of danger, resistance is the sign that that signal of danger is being experienced. I can't go on. I won't go on. It's hard to go on. I'm suddenly disorganized and I can't think. I'm drawing a blank. These are all signs of anxiety expressed as resistance. So if we change our theory of anxiety as a kind of signal, we're changing our theory of resistance and how it functions in the psyche, right? And this is where the whole idea of the research paradigm comes around again, all right? So I hope that answers the question. You see, where that third category operates. It's in Lacan's discussion. I'll just throw this in for those of you who are students of Lacan. It's in Lacan's discussion of the transference in seminar 8 of Lacan, where he links anxiety and desire and talks about inhibition symptoms and anxiety. And it's precisely where he works on this question of how resistance, anxiety link up with the expression of desire in the way that I reconfigured Ohm's law for you a moment ago, right? The idea that anxiety and desire, like resistance and current flow, are always in relation to each other. And the drive is constant, right? If I had a blackboard, I could put up Ohm's law, voltage equals resistance times amperage. And you could put it up, drive equals resistance / anxiety times desire, right?
David, could I just interrupt for 1 second?
Yeah.
We're getting a lot of questions in the chat.
Good.
And I also have one that is related to this redefinition of anxiety in the text that precedes the addendum, which
Yep.
is it seemed to me that the redefinition of anxiety um kind of arrived at a point that argued that all anxiety was separation anxiety, and that all sense of threat indexed in original um uh trauma of separation at the moment of birth. And I'm wondering how, yeah, to what extent anxiety is always about the question of separation or separability. And
Yeah.
yeah, anyway.
No, it's a good question. In that section, Freud, he's struggling with the question well, where does the energy for the signal come from? Where does it, how does a signal come about? And he does one of those dialectical things that Freud does, which is that he says, yeah, he says, I think probably it all comes about from the first moment of birth anxiety, birth trauma. That's a kind of energy of a sense of danger, a sense of threat that the neonate experiences. But he does say in a sentence right so after that, that the subject then takes that energy and applies it as a signal in all kinds of different ways after that. That is, that it's a kind of prototype, but it's not, and this is where, as I say, it's dialectical. How is that? Is it that we're always experiencing birth anxiety, or is it that birth anxiety provides a kind of energic model, which then becomes the model that gets applied in other forms of signaling danger, right? And the second is a slightly different read on it. It's that there's a kind of, you might say, metonymic chain of situations where a danger is experienced. And the chain starts with the birth, but it doesn't carry that meaning in these other situations where a sense of danger to the subject is experienced. Does that make sense, Wendy?
Yeah, that's very helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have some follow-up questions, but I want to just get into some of what's coming up in the chat, if that's okay,
Great.
unless you have
Yeah,
more
no,
that you
that's
wanted
great.
to.
Let's no,
Okay.
let's do it. Yeah, I know.
Yeah. So I'm going to try to synthesize a couple. There's a question about the the relationship between resistance and refusal,
Yeah.
as it relates to anxiety and steadfastness in the psychic sense. But then there are also several questions about um, politics. So I'm wondering if we can also extend the question of refusal to the social or political. So
Yeah. 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 Yeah, I'm not sure what exactly the question is about refusal, or is it simply the question, is that, maybe I use that word. Uh, I get that,
how
in
these
fact.
terms
Yeah,
differ.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. All right, there's a few things to say about that. Lacan brings the notion of refusal in when he's talking about anxiety. Um, Refusal is an interesting idea because the question, of course, is it uh, always to be considered a kind of conscious refusal? Or are we talking about, what is effectively a refusal, what we might call a shutting down, right, of the system, a slowing down of the system, a hesitation, a kind of blocking, something that the subject might not even be conscious of in any way, but something refuses in the discourse, right? And the analyst's, now I'm speaking clinically, the analyst's capacity to hear something like a kind of refusal in the discourse, right, as a sign of resistance, as related in some way to an anxiety, an unspoken anxiety, right? That would be the linkage, right? So uh, we have to leave open the idea that not only is it a refusal by the conscious subject, but in a certain sense, it refuses, right? What it? Well, that gets to the addendum in Freud's discussion of the different forms of resistance. Freud uh, comes to recognize that that in fact there are a number of different, once we understand resistance as related to anxiety signals, and once we begin to see it working in the system, we have to recognize that it doesn't just work as a conscious endeavor, although it sometimes does. that in fact what we're talking about is a number of different ways of working. And ultimately, Freud names five different, and he doesn't say these are the only five. He says there are at least five different ways that resistance works in the psyche or in treatment, and probably in both, right? There is resistance, which is the resistance of repression. I'll go into this quickly because I know there are other questions, but and then it's a long answer to the question. But I want to get this in, and then I'll take more questions. All right. So be patient. Let me. That of these five resistances, Freud says three of them are related to, in some way, to the conscious, preconscious ego. They can be made conscious. They can be considered ego-related processes. One of them, he says, is not. It's related to directly an expression of it. It refuses, the id. And another, the fifth, is related instead to the superego, somehow on the level of the social, on the level of the expectation of one's place in relation to others, there is a resistance. So the three that are related to the ego, the first is the classic repression. One way to put that, let me just would be something like, I have nothing to say. The patient comes in and just draws a blank, and or in the middle of speaking, there is a kind of refusal in the sense of, I've got nothing more, I don't know, I've got nothing more to say, right? And the analyst, there's a sort of repression resistance. The second is transference resistance, the one I talked about that Freud discovered in the 1910, 1912, he wrote about in the papers. That is, there's nothing to say to you. I would convey that resistance that way. It's not that there's nothing to say, but I'm not about to say it to you right now. Either because if I said it to you, it would be a declaration of love or a declaration of hate. That is, that somehow questions of love and hate and passion are at stake in this, and there is something about saying that which signals a kind of danger for me. So that's a transference resistance. The third is a resistance that Freud talks about as also on the level of the ego, a resistance of the symptom. He doesn't call it a resistance of the symptom. He calls it a resistance of secondary gain. This is a very important resistance, something that Lacan develops later into the notion of the symptom. And that is that I refuse because I sense the danger that in speaking, my symptom loses its energy. I can't enjoy my symptom. If I let go and say this, it's going to deplete the investment I have in the symptom that brought me to analysis. It's paradoxical, it's contradictory, but every analyst encounters it, is that this kind of not wanting to give up the symptom. So the pleasure in the symptom, or the jouissance in the symptom, right? The fourth is this thing, it refuses. The it refuses directly from the id is perhaps the most obscure, the most difficult, and involves the notion of repetition and the death drive. That is, that the reason there is a refusal is that to speak is to possibly say something new, is to possibly encounter a sense of possibility, to encounter a sense of possibility. And the resistance is that that sense of possibility is dangerous, and that there is instead a kind of wish to remain or a drive to remain in a state of nothing new, in a state of endless repetition, and that this is a kind of resistance from the id, right? Uh, as I say, we could talk entirely about that for plenty of time, but I'll just point to it. The fifth is the superegoic resistance. That is resistance on the level of, were I to say what I need to say, what I to say what I want to say, what I to say what comes to mind, it would be criminal. It would be transgressive. It would be disruptive on a level, and I want to do that, and I feel guilty about the desire to do that, and out of that guilt, I don't do it. You know, it's a kind of guilt mediated resistance. Now, what I want to do, because I'm aware of the time and I want to make sure we have time to discuss this, so I want to do it, if I can, as quickly so as to leave time. All of these, what I'm interested in, as I said, is how to regulate that, how to recognize that it's not in these things operating simply as refusals, but in recognizing how these various refusals constitute our being as social beings. They constitute our subjectivity. These various modulated resistances. That to resist is precisely to be a social being. It's precisely to play, to indicate to the other by these hesitations, by these sensitivities, by these modulations, to go back to the Ohm's law model that I was sketching out, by these modulations, I express something of my subjectivity, and not just something of my subjectivity. It is how I express my subjectivity. Indeed, one could take it a step further. It is subjectivity. That is, that subjectivity and resistance become the same thing. Our subjectivity, insofar as it is it is a discursive being, is the modulation of resistance, right? That's what I take Freud to be saying ultimately in this development in the late theory. I'm going to stop there because I think that's enough laid out, and let's see the questions and what kind of discussion you'd like to have.
Thank you. That was extremely helpful. Thank you, David. Okay, so we have a lot of questions in the chat. I'm happy to read them aloud, but also it's nice to see people. So
Yeah.
feel free, if you wrote a question, to ask it. I'm wondering, Lena, if you want to ask your question, since it's sort of related. If you're here, otherwise I'm happy to read it out loud. Okay, I can read it.
Yeah.
So the question from Lena is, you were this sort of, you came back to this when you were talking about to resist is to become a social being or to become a subject, and you were talking about resistance as the music that the analyst needs to listen to, and the question is that in light of thinking of resistance as part of what makes a system work, as opposed to an interruption of that system, how might we scale that out to think about resistance politically as something that makes a system
Yeah,
work? And yeah.
yeah, yeah, exactly. I've been thinking about that. I'm glad you asked that question. Um, I do think that insofar as we want to take some of this and think about it in terms of the political question of resistance, um, uh, and the never-ending question about what makes resistance, what can uh, um, increase the possibility of effective resistance, let's say resistance in relation to state power, which is certainly the kind of question that we're all confronting right now. Um, the idea that something like a kind of uh, um, presence of the subject is linked in its very character and structure uh, to the functions of resistance. That is, to speak, to be present, to articulate, to organize, to have meetings, to convey desire. In all ways that one conveys it, functions as a resistance, functions as resistance. That is, that it sort of broadens, in my view, the idea of the political. That is and it both broadens the political and it animates how the political can operate. The whole question about political theater, for example, or how art can possibly operate politically, how political action can be receptive to open discourse and debate and freedom of speech rather than becoming dogmatic and authoritarian in itself, the political action, I mean. These are old issues on the left, right? The whole idea that very sort of narrower views of what resistance must look like, the disciplining of resistance. This is a very, very old question. It's a fight on the left going back to its beginnings, right? Um, and I think what I'm suggesting, this is one way that psychoanalysis speaks to that question. It says, cast a fairly wide net, be quite receptive to the idea of what it is that constitutes resistance, and don't prejudge. Don't narrow it down. Don't treat it as though it's definable only in one way, right? Um, but be aware that one thing, this gets that the non-expression of resistance. That is, if there is a dialectic, if there can be so much resistance in a system, within a system, that it actually shuts down, right? Or on the other hand, if there is so little resistance in a system that it short circuits, it has no resistance, and the drive just explodes out without any resistance, right? A system without resistance doesn't function, or a system with too much resistance doesn't function, right? That there is something about the modulation of resistance as a kind of thought, activity, analogized it with music as an expressive vehicle and this has to do with psychoanalysis as well as with politics. That is, when an analysis starts to look like an analysis, you know you're deep in a resistance, right? When an analyst starts to sound like an analyst, when an analysand comes in and starts to behave like an analysand, right? You've got a system which has got, it's being shut down by resistance, right? Even though it looks like it's functioning. And that's a similar situation with politics. You know, just because it looks like politics, just because you get together and do the things that look like politics, that isn't the point. The point is to see how this play of resistance works in relation to desire, as I was talking before, right? And so the function of desire in politics is what it comes around to again. You can think back to Deleuze and the desiring machine, if you like, you know, in sort of 60s arguments around this question. Does that address your question a little bit?
I think that was a great answer. It was Lena's question, but that sounded very helpful to me. It also sounds like resistance is, I don't know if this term is useful, but it sounds like it is also productive of something like form, like resistance gives gives form to a
Yeah, yeah,
subject or to a political movement.
yeah.
Um, so there's another question about the psyche and the political concerning the question of legibility. So Miro asks, it's a question about acknowledging when resistance to divulging psychic data to a psychoanalyst is resistance to colonial power dynamics. Is it necessary for a patient to make themselves legible to the psychoanalyst in order to heal, or is resistance to that very dynamic a form of healing
Yeah,
resistance to
it's a
colonial
great,
social contract? Yeah.
yeah, it's a great question. You know, because, you know, first of all, making legible, you know, I'm cognizant of the term making as well as the legibility there. Who's making? I understand it's being used in the sense of making it available or producing it, but it also involves the idea of a certain force being made to be legible. Is there a force? Must you make your patients be legible, or must the patient be made to be legible? And you know, it's exactly that question of power um, that has to be interrogated in the system in relation to resistance, right? There's something about power and resistance there that's at play, and the analyst, and to answer the question is asked in a kind of general sense, for analysis to work, must the analysand necessarily, you know, make legible. Um, you know, under the power of a kind of analytic law, I suppose, you know, that it won't work. You know, you will be a violator of the analytic, and it won't function. The system won't function. You know, the problem with the nuances to that, it seems to me, are that the questions whose resistance is at stake there, right? Uh, you know, there's the famous line of Lacan's is that resistance is always the analyst's resistance. You know, it seems to me apt at that moment is that, you know, it's easier to see that as the subject's resistance, but the subject is resisting in relation to something that the analyst has not taken account of or is not cognizant of in the position that the analyst has assumed. this idea that they must be made legible under the power structures of a sort of, post-colonial structure. Well, that suggests something about how the analyst is situated in that analysis. That may very well be about the resistance of the analyst. Um, so it'd be very, in which case it would be, the answer to your question would be, uh, it's the analyst's self-interrogation at that point, which is relevant. It's the analyst being able to look at the position that she or he is in. If there is this sense of something being made not legible, what is it the analyst is doing that sets up that problem, right? Once again, I haven't seen the questioner, so it's a little awkward. This is
Yeah,
Zoom
I'm gonna see
awkwardness.
if people want
So
to
yeah,
ask
yeah,
their own
yeah.
questions,
If
but
you want to
this
follow
is
up,
great.
if you
Thank you
want
so
to,
much.
yeah, if if it's not, you know,
Yeah.
yeah.
Miro, for instance, do you have was that helpful if you're there and able to turn on your camera?
Yeah, I think it's just such a vast subject that like so many questions come to mind that it could be like a whole segment. So I think I'm still processing and kind of just questioning the last part of what you said of like, is that even yeah, I think I'm having a hard time. Typing's easier for me right now than speaking, so apologies. Thanks.
Oh, that's perfectly all right. Yeah, this question of the resistance of the analyst and what it says about the frame of analysis and what is possible about analysis, because that becomes a corollary to your question, is analysis possible if something is not spoken? Freud says no, that as soon as there's something unspoken, as for the metaphor Freud uses, that all of the things, all of the psychopathology goes and hides in that little location of the unspoken, right? So that you can't allow anything of the unspoken without making the analysis dysfunctional. On the other hand, the unspoken is always present. In all the whole truth cannot be spoken. This is a dialectical question. It's not a either or question. And it just in a sense, I'm repeating myself. It behooves the analyst to be attuned to this question, if possible. It's not inherent in the structure of analysis. Well, or maybe it is inherent, but it's modifiable by the analyst's attending to resistance in his or her place, right? This is very true with political questions. When you talk about analysts who function like, they're under the junta in Argentina or in Brazil, in New York. I come from people who have a long leftist background, and an uncle of mine who was in analysis way back when could only be in analysis with a member of the Communist Party in New York. There was a very small group of analysts who knew each other because if you weren't in analysis with somebody who was a member of the Communist Party, you couldn't talk about your life as a member of the party. You'd be outing people. So the whole question of, what could be or couldn't be spoken and to whom is a really old question for me in my relationship to psychoanalysis.
Great. Halia, do you want to ask a question?
Sure. Thanks, David. Yeah, I'll just read what I typed because it's
Good. Yep.
be a long, convoluted question that I tried to compact. So I've written, what is the relationship between the need for repression, for survival, for the greater good, in other words, repression in social life as law, and I'm thinking of primary repression, or I'm thinking of Freud's metapsychology, my understanding of that kind of repression for civilization, as it were, and resistance.
Yeah.
So could political resistance be like the inverse or even the opposite of the kind of resistance that we talk about in the clinic, or that, as in that we've been covering, I guess, today? The former, as in political resistance, being the inability or the incapacity to accept the quote unquote law, when this is not merely for the social glue or for the social good, but rather for oppression, deprivation, and death.
Yeah.
So I realize it's a big question, but yeah, thanks.
No. It's a very important question. That primary repression, or the resistance that is repression, that's the first resistance that Freud talks about in the addendum to inhibition symptoms and anxiety. It's that resistance that you're referring to. And as you say, it is constitutive of social life and social being. Uh, you know, on the level of the subject, rather than the political question that you bring it to, which I'll try to address as well, on the level of the subject, there is an important thing that we have to recognize, and which is that the law, and in psychoanalysis, what we mean is the prohibition of incest is primarily what we mean by the law inside psychoanalysis. That is, there's something you cannot do on the level of desire and sexuality. There is a kind of no, there's a kind of limit to how you can enjoy your desires. That law, uh, on the one hand, operates as the repression and signals the resistance, which is necessary, as you say, to constituting the subject. But the secret, of course, is that we all transgress that law. You both observe it and you transgress it in life, right? The neurotic is so burdened by that law that there is no even playing with it. There's no transgressing it. There's no finding ways to express the forbidden, the too much, the incestuous. You experience in fantasy something about your lover as an incestuous object, and you freak out and stop. Or you work through that and think, well, that's a fantasy about my lover as an incestuous object. I can enjoy that, even if it's transgressive, because it's a fantasy, because it's not, in fact, incest. You see what I mean? I think there's something of that in the second part of your question. Right? There's something of that is that the law is operates both in its observance and in its transgression. And it's something about the modulated transgression. It's a little bit of an insipid way of putting it, perhaps, but that maybe is the question of the political. Is because modulated in the sense I was talking about before, of the modulation of resistance. That is, burn it down, but don't burn it all down. Be transgressive, but also be cognizant of the level of transgression, and have the courage to strike, but also have the awareness of what the strike is and what it means. Or you see what I mean?
May I?
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely see. I worry that the kind of enjoying of transgression, because we've been seeing the enjoyment of transgression by the law itself, right? By
Yeah.
scriptures.
Yeah.
who parade in underwear and
Yeah,
decimate, villages, detonate, that's a kind of
yeah,
enjoyment of the law, isn't it?
yeah,
And
yeah.
then that, I wonder, I don't think psychoanalysis creates, or the tools that we're thinking with, I don't think they create an equivalence between that and then perhaps the enjoyment of, let's say, something like solidarity, transgressing the law in order to reinstate a social bond rather than to break one entirely or to abuse it or to kind of like merely enjoy it because you can. So I wonder how it can help us think about one as a kind of political resistance, which is maybe different than the one in the clinic, I don't know, and the other one as a kind of obscenity of transgression that the military undertakes in a sense,
Yeah,
right?
no, it's a great question. It's a very, yes, yeah, of course. And it brings into play something about the perverse as a psychoanalytic concept, right? Because the perverse is a way of transgressing where it's not only a transgression that respects the law, but a transgression which actually um, turns the law on its head. It sort of displaces the law, right? The law of some sort of no, some sort of restraint. And how that operates, I think we'd have to get into that question. Uh, the relation to the other in psychoanalysis, um, because that's the last part of your question as well. Uh, is the area where I think, as I said at the beginning, Freud left us with things to be worked out. He didn't, not the Freudian project is not, Freud died, and that's when he stopped. But the Freudian project didn't stop there. And the question of that, the question of what psychoanalysis has to say about the place of the other, I think is one of the things we've been working on since Freud's death. There's the Lacan seminar from another to another. Lacan was preoccupied with the question of the other. Uh, um, there's a whole return to relational thinking in different aspects of psychoanalysis, struggling with the question of the social other and how to think of that in relation to the question of desire and perversion. To go back to what I was saying before. I think that would be the area I would want to work on with that question. But it's such a complicated question you're touching on. It's like some of the other questions. It would merit a whole, we could spend 2 hours on that one alone, I think. It's very important. But I think those are the factors that I would be looking at, with something to do with the question of transgression in relation to perversion, which is not the same thing as transgression in relation to neurotic sublimation, right?
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that was very helpful. Thanks. So we're approaching the 90-minute mark. There's a few questions that ask for and I think this will have to be the last, but anyone who wants to continue this conversation, I assure you that we have opened up a conversation that will continue into future weeks. And even if we won't have David with us necessarily, we'll be uh, pursuing these lines of thought. But there are a few questions about the resolution of resistance in the clinic, and I think also whether resistance is something that ought to be resolved in practice, in psychoanalytic practice. So if you could maybe just close on the idea of resolving
Yeah,
resistance,
yeah,
that would be wonderful. And
yeah,
thank you again, everyone, so much for your questions. It's been
yeah,
wonderful.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Likewise, I thank you all. It's a good question. If we're going to end on that, it's a good question. It's sort of returning to the clinical. I think that even as we draw from psychoanalysis to talk about the political or talk about the social. It's important to be true to the discourse within the frame of psychoanalysis as well, not to stretch too quickly to these other modes, because that we lose something that way. We have to kind of attend to the logic of the discipline itself, as in trying to articulate these things, and then we'll see how it's possible to move across disciplines. So this question clinically about it's a very long-standing and well-debated question, the question of working with resistance. There are analysts who define themselves as primarily analysts of resistance. They're, if you're in, I mean, and then of course how resistance is defined by those analysts. So it's extremely complex. The idea that resistance is something, it brings back the idea that we should get rid of it so that something else can express itself. And the analyst should be the one to try to work on getting rid of it. One of the things that in my clinical work and that I think of is that if it's true that resistance is linked very closely to the expression of desire, and if what it is that we're doing as analysts is trying to foster the articulation of desire, is it perhaps better not to focus on getting rid of the resistance per se as an act, as an active clinical endeavor, but instead taking note of it and trying to hear what the articulation of desire might be that's accompanying this resistance and speak to that. That is, to listen carefully to what the resistance might be saying about something like desire, and indicate that that's what one hears as analyst. To mark it or emphasize it. And the point being this, that rather than getting into a kind of struggle, which lends itself to the possibility of a kind of game of power about resistance, where the analyst tries to get the analyst in to give up their resistance, and there's a fight over that. The other way of hearing how this might be, in fact, a moment where there's actually something to be listened to on the level of desire, creates an alliance between the analyst and the analyst's end of a different sort. It's not about trying to get the analyst end to give up. It's saying, I hear you saying something about this. It's being heard. It's this indication that something is being listened to that might be a place where more could be said, right? In sort of the conveyance of desire and fantasy and wish. So that would be my thought about that question. Is it it's a different way of addressing the question of resistance. It's hearing it by all means, in the sense that it's part of the system, but not fighting it. Right.
Thank you, David.
Yeah.
There are a lot of questions that came up in the chat, which I'll save, and if we can revisit them in future sessions. And for those that are specific to David, for instance, the one about the communist analysts, well, we'll follow up and get more info. But thanks so much for your time, David. This was fantastic, and I think really set us off on the right foot for the seminar. So thank you for joining, and You're welcome back in any of our subsequent sessions.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you. Thank you all. Yeah. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.